Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm Heidi Shoup, President of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., and on behalf of our Board of Directors and members, I want to thank you for your attendance here today and for your support of the Council's global education efforts. I would also like to thank the Raytheon Corporation, the principal sponsor for this program, for their support. We welcome our speakers today, the Honorable William Perry, former Secretary of Defense, and the Honorable Stephen Hadley, former National Security Advisor. Together, they co-chaired the congressionally mandated 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review Independent Panel. They will discuss the panel's recommendations to Congress, as well as to take your questions and the questions of our online viewers. Our moderator is the Honorable Franklin Kramer, a national security and international affairs expert who has served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs for President Clinton and previously as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. He currently serves as the chairman of our board, the World Affairs Council Board of Directors, and is capstone professor of the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. He is the principal editor and author of several chapters of the book Cyber Power and National Security, among other numerous books and articles. He received a JD from Harvard and a BA from Yale. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Franklin Kramer, who will introduce our other distinguished speakers.
Thanks very much, Heidi, and let me thank all of you for coming. I think this is a chance to really hear some extraordinary people set forth some important conclusions that they reached in the review of the Quadrennial Defense Report, and also for all of you to engage in a conversation with them, and we hope that this will be, in effect, a conversation. I want to thank all of our sponsors. I know Raytheon in particular sponsored the activity, and the two people that we have here are really what I would consider the absolute best of America, the best that America has to offer. I've worked for and with the both of them. Bill Perry, of course, was the Secretary of Defense. I had the opportunity to meet him when he was the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering in 1977. He was extraordinarily broad in terms of what he did. He brought some of the most important programs into the U.S. inventory, as well as having an international affairs cast. And when he was Secretary of Defense, he really helped the President lead the entire foreign policy establishment in the, among other things, the NATO set of activities, the Balkans and the like. So it's a privilege to have him here. Steve Hadley is a long time friend. He, of course, was the National Security Advisor for President Bush. Before that, he was the deputy. Before that, he was on the National Security Council staff. And I can say as early as 1977, someone said to me one day, if you don't know Steve Hadley, you don't really understand who's important in national security affairs. He went on to have a considerable career. He was Assistant Secretary of Defense under the first President Bush and has done a variety of other sets of activities. The two of them, I think, brought forth a report that is extraordinarily comprehensive in terms of both its analysis of the problems, but even more importantly with respect to the set of activities and set of recommendations that they propose. They even took on, and you'll hear, they even took on the Congress, which is the perhaps the most difficult national security problem that we all face. Peace, on that issue, as well as the normal set of threats. So we are really privileged to have each of them here. They will speak and set forth what they feel were the important elements of the report, and then we'll go on to a question and answer session. Let me turn it over to Steve Hadley and Bill Perry.
When Steve and I were appointed by the Congress to serve as co-chairs, we were handed by the Congress, the members of the committee. We had nothing to say in their selection. Turned out to be pretty good people, but I want to say it was not our choices. And they were half Democrats and half Republicans, because the Congress thought this needed to be a bipartisan effort. And the idea of bipartisan in the congressional mind is that the Democratic appointees would represent their points of view and the Republicans would represent their points of view, and somehow we get a combination of views from this. At our first meeting, or before our first meeting, Steve and I met and decided that wasn't the way we wanted to operate. So at our first meeting, we told the members three things. First of all, we intended to operate not as a bipartisan group, but as a nonpartisan group. Very important distinction. That is, we would seek to find the right answers, not seek to find a balance between Democratic and Republican views. Secondly, we intended to produce a consensus report. Consensus with no footnotes, all agreement. And finally, we intended to reach, in spite of that consensus report, we intended the report to have significant findings, conclusions, and recommendations. We were going to water them down to get to the consensus. Those are pretty bold objectives that we set. I believe that we achieved all three of those goals. And that was only possible because of the close bond between Steve and myself, the two co-chairs, and because of Steve's incredible skills as a negotiator. I just stood by and wondered and watched him as he handled the reconciliation that was necessary to get this kind of report. Today, we're going to give you a summary of the findings of our commission, and we're going to start off with Steve.
I just want to mention that it was Bill Perry's leadership that got this very diverse group to decide that, in fact, a consensus report was the right thing to do. And one of the things he came up with early on was that an insight that the way to get a consensus report is not necessarily to go to the lowest common denominator, but it's actually to be bold and let your panel know that your report could be a vehicle for getting important ideas that many of the panel members had been pushing for a long time to a broader audience. And the second thing we did was we had a process that invested the members of the commission in the report. We divided into panels. We had individual panels actually write sections of the report and then incorporated that into the text. And it was really that process and Bill's leadership that resulted in a consensus report. And as we know from the Deficit Reduction Commission, getting a consensus is not easy in Washington these days, and it's really a tribute to Bill's leadership. The purpose of the independent panel, of course, was to review the Quadrennial Defense Review. This is a document that the Department of Defense prepares every 4 years, and it outlines what is defense policy and strategy, what are the force structures, resources that are required to achieve that strategy. And the Congress asked for this independent review. And they pushed us very hard early on in 4 directions. One, they wanted a 20-year horizon, which is a long way to plan in anything. They wanted us to develop force structure alternatives. They wanted us to do it in a budgetarily unconstrained environment. And they wanted us to look beyond the wars in which we were currently engaged. We did that, and one of the things that we did, and one of the things that Bill said to the committees of Congress very early on, is that this is a wartime Quadrennial Defense Review, or QDR, and that Bob Gates was right to make it a wartime QDR and to put as a priority fighting and winning the nation's wars and doing what we needed to do to support our men and women in uniform in that effort. That was a correct focus. But in addition, we tried to look beyond the current wars at the prospects for 21st century conflict. where were we going to be headed from a national security and defense policy standpoint. We tried to look at the so-called grand strategy of the United States. Did we have one, and if so, what is it? And what we found looking at that effort is that it's very difficult prospectively to articulate something that looks like a grand strategy for a national security and defense policy. Everybody talks about NSC 68, which is a magnificent document. But as Brent Scowcroft used to say, and still says, that was an easier time. One of the virtues of the Cold War was that at any point in time, your president and national security staff was worried about one big thing, the Soviet Union, and a couple little things, the crises or negotiations of the day. The world today is very different since the end of the Cold War. At any point in time, you've got about 12 pots on the stove, and all of them are near boiling. And in that kind of world, with a variety of challenges, it's very difficult to have something that looks like a coherent grand strategy. 3 administrations have now tried to articulate one, and I think our independent panel thought none had done it particularly well. That said, we did define that you could discern what our grand strategy has been retrospectively by looking at what decisions presidents had made, particularly with respect to use of force. And when we did that, we found 4 enduring security interests of the United States. And this, in some sense, drove our analysis. And they are the following: defense of the American homeland, the assured access to sea, space, air, and cyberspace, the preservation of a favorable balance of power across Eurasia and preventing authoritarian domination of that region, and helping to provide for the global common good through things like humanitarian assistance, development assistance, and disaster release. Now, what we found was that there are 4 trends affecting our ability to protect and advance these interests. And these 5 global trends were radical Islamic extremism and the threat of terror, the rise of new global great powers in Asia, particularly China and India, the continued struggle for power in the Persian Gulf and the Middle East, and of course the focus on Iran, an accelerating global competition for resources, and the persistent problems of failed and failing states. These were going to be the challenges and also the opportunities for pursuing our core interests in the time ahead. We looked at the issue of soft power, believed that we needed to do a better job of coordinating soft power, so-called soft power, in pursuit of our national interests, but thought, regrettably, in the challenges we faced, hard power is going to be a key element of dealing with a number of the challenges we face. And finally, we emphasize the need for continuing American leadership globally. One of the keys for achieving our interests, protecting our interests, advancing our interests in this global environment is what we called a comprehensive approach to achieving our objectives. There's been a lot of talk recently about the whole of government approach, getting all departments and agencies of the U.S. government in a coordinated way, pursuing a strategy to achieve national objectives. Our view was that there are other actors in most of these problems that need to participate and to be taken into account, and these are our allies and other nations, the NGO and private voluntary organization communities, and of course international organizations. And so what we need is, yes, a whole of government approach to get the U.S. government organized to pursue a strategy toward a common set of objectives, but we need a comprehensive approach that also coordinates this broader set of actors. And that requires the ability and developing the ability to plan, train, exercise, deploy, and operate in the field, in the theater, on a coordinated basis, bringing together all these assets and resources. In the report, we make a number of suggestions of how to better enhance our capacity to pursue a comprehensive approach. A number of them are directed at the executive branch. The challenge, of course, within the executive branch, and particularly for the National Security Council, is integration across the stovepipes of the separate interests and activities and organizations of our departments and agencies. And we make a number of suggestions as to how to improve that process. We also, as Bill talked about, or as Frank talked about, thought we needed to reform our legislative and particularly our congressional committee process in order for it to adequately discharge the responsibilities of Congress in meeting the challenges of this new age. It turns out there is something that people have forgotten about, a group called the Joint Committee on the Organization of the Congress, which was created in 1945 and actually reported and recommended to the Congress the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1946 that actually established the structure of the current Congress in terms of committees, in terms of establishing a professional and clerical staff that is a permanent staff, in terms of getting them information, resources, and the like. And our proposal is that Joint Committee be reconvened and to look at the issue of organization of Congress to meet the challenges in the 21st century. In particular, we think they should look at the notion of a single appropriation subcommittee that would appropriate for state, AID, defense, intelligence communities, and the Homeland Security Department, and better coordination among the authorization committees with responsibility for those various groups. We propose a national committee on building the civilian force of the future, because we do not have in our civilian departments and agencies the expeditionary capacity to deploy on short notice to theaters of conflict or post-conflict or theaters of conflict prevention, and particularly to partner with our military to achieve national objectives there. We need that capability in the U.S. government. We need it also in a civilian response capability. We also need to spend more time building partner capacity in our friends and allies so that they can share in this work, and hopefully in each case we can transfer responsibilities, particularly on the military side, to them. Finally, we talked about the need to do better planning in order to have a comprehensive approach to achieving national objectives. We actually proposed that the independent panel go out of existence. We proposed actually that the QDR be discontinued and that its functions be handled by the normal planning, programming, budgeting, and execution process within the Department of Defense. What we thought was really missing was a real strategic look at the challenges we face. And so what we proposed was the creation by Congress and the President working together an independent strategic review panel, which 6 months before a presidential inauguration would have produced a report by a group of perhaps 18 independent experts from the outside looking at the world that we faced, assessing the environment, prioritizing U.S. goals, and indicating where are the risks of current strategy and how current strategy might be altered. And that a new administration coming in would then take that report as a down payment and a way of triggering a national security strategic planning process, which would develop a true national strategy with enough granularity to give guidance to the Department of Defense on its mission and its force structure and its resources. And this national security, this national strategic planning process would produce a national security strategy, which would then be taken to drive the internal planning processes of the various departments and agencies as again, a way to provide a planning framework for what we hope would be both a whole of government effort and a comprehensive approach towards achieving national objectives. Bill?
A major part of our charge from the Congress was to come up with a force structure recommendations. Well, for many decades during the Cold War, the prime mission of the Department of Defense was to build a force structure capable of deterring the Soviet Union. Now, that mission was hard to implement, but it was easy to describe. All other missions were considered lesser included cases. That is, they would be adequately covered by the force we built for that primary mission. In 1993, we prepared the bottom-up review because we recognized that the mission had changed in fundamental ways with the ending of the Cold War. At that time, we determined that a primary mission was to build a military force capable of successfully engaging two major regional conflicts. If we wanted to identify the two we were thinking of then, it was North Korea and Iraq. All other missions, we believed, were lesser included cases. So we sized the force structure to try to meet the 2 MRC requirement. Today, neither of those assumptions is valid. A major part of our military is engaged in 2 insurgency operations. Thus, not surprisingly, the QDR prepared by the Department of Defense focused on success in Afghanistan. And as I told the Congress, had I been the Secretary of Defense when we prepared this QDR, that's what I would have done also. So what we said was in no way a criticism of what the decision Bob Gates made in his QDR. A consequence of that was much less attention was paid to prospective future missions. For example, the possibility that at some future date we might have to face a peer competitor. But a broad force planning construct is a powerful level to shape the DoD for the future. And we think that the absence of that in the QDR was, while understandable, was a missed opportunity. To partially fill this gap, our commission offered our own judgments about the force structure that might be needed in the 20-year planning horizon specified by the Congress. We based these judgments on the assumed trends and missions that Steve Hadley has just described to you. And we offered the following judgments on future force structure. First of all, recent additions to ground forces will need to be sustained for the planning period. That is, we've already added substantial new ground forces, and our judgment was that was not a temporary surge. That would be needed to be sustained for the foreseeable future. Secondly, we said that the Air Force has about the right force structure, except for the need to augment long-range strike, again, looking ahead to the future. Third, we need to increase maritime force. Increase. Very clear. And we did that. We said that was needed to sustain the ability over the long term for free transit in the Western Pacific area. Then we said the Defense Department needs to be prepared to assist civil departments in the event of a cyber attack on the homeland. We talked a lot about that, and we believed that a cyber attack was not just a fanciful notion, but it was something that was going to happen soon, and going to have a major impact on. The United States probably is more vulnerable to a cyber attack than any other nation in the world because of our increasing dependence on cyber networks. We have an amazing capability in that regard in the National Security Agency, but we're talking about attacks on banks and corporations, not so much on attacks on the military. At that time, the Department of Homeland Security was thinking of forming its own group to do this. And we believe that would be a huge mistake, that we had to somehow figure out a way for the National Security Agency to provide this function uniquely for the whole nation, just as they have for decades provided been the national agent for doing the cryptology defense. So we made that strong recommendation. I think indeed the country is in fact moving in that direction now. We said that a portion of the National Guard should be dedicated to Homeland Security, and that more generally we needed to revisit the contract which the Defense Department has with the Guard and Reserves. We put a very heavy emphasis on the importance of Guard and Reserves in our future security. We looked at the need for recapitalization in the Defense Department, and particularly with the ongoing wars we have, our equipment is wearing out and getting broken at an amazing rate. We said major recapitalization will be required. The Gates directive on efficiencies in acquisition is a good start, but in our judgment would not cover the costs that are going to be needed to cover future capitalization costs. Our bottom line on all of this is that things we were talking about could not be done with the present top line. that additional top line would be required. It will be expensive, but deferring recapitalization probably would be even more expensive over the long term. So that was our comment on force structure. We also had major discussion on acquisition and contracting. We tried to avoid just pontificating on this area, which is common in panels on this subject. The top line was that major improvements were needed and possible in acquisition, needed and possible. We observed that the major procurement programs this past decade have dragged on for 10 to 15 years or even longer with expensive cost overruns. And our judgment was that the length of a program was a measure of how much it had failed and how much it was going to be overrun. We made a strong recommendation that the Defense Department set and sustain a limit of 5 to 7 years from the beginning of a defined and desired programs to the delivery of the first operational hardware. We do not believe this is pie in the sky. It's been successfully done on programs in the past. The F-15, the F-16, the F-117 were all done in those time limits, and were all done within cost. The overruns and the failure of programs is directly related to how much time it takes to get to the program. And these long delays are attributable primarily to adding requirements as the program goes along. To do this, it requires the program discipline to defer desired improvements to follow-on production runs. You have an F-15A, F-15B, F-15C. That's the way you handle the improvement, not try to get them all in the first product. That was the major conclusion we made in the procurement area. We did talk about dual sourcing, and it said good things about it. It said it should be always done when you can be shown the dual sourcing will provide real competition. It gets to be a problem when you get down to something like submarines, when you're not making enough of them to really sustain dual source competition. And finally, we recommended establishing a regular program in acquisition for dealing with urgent needs. And we pointed, for example, to Afghanistan, where the usual rules for acquisition simply do not apply. When you get a requirement for the field for equipment that's needed 3 to 6 months, obviously the usual acquisition programs do not apply to that. Here, what we did is point to the program that the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Technology and Logistics has already established for Afghanistan. So there should be some way of institutionalizing that approach so that it can be done on other programs in the future. Our third and final comment has to do with personnel. We were unanimous in our belief that the all-volunteer source has been a great success. But also we were unanimous in believing that the dramatic increases in costs in the last decade or so cannot be sustained. And we must seriously address the following issues. If we cannot find a way of sustaining those costs, the outcome will either be a reduction in force, a reduction in benefits, or some compromised all-volunteer force. And to avoid those outcomes, we had to reconsider long-standing practices. What am I talking about long-standing? Well, first of all, the expected length. We thought it was necessary to extend the length of expected service. The idea that the standard service is 20 years or 25 years, so we think is crazy. And the fact that you can have very highly qualified, capable people, and you force them out when they're 48 or 50 or 52 is just a very inefficient system. That needs fundamental overhaul, we believe. Secondly, we need to, and related to that, we need to revise the up and out practice, which is deeply entrenched in the service today, we believe is wrong and needs to be changed fundamentally. And then finally, we need to revise TRICARE benefits. The medical costs are just going absolutely out of sight in the military as they are in the civil sector, but it's even worse than that, is the costs, the healthcare costs of retired personnel is getting completely out of control. Now, those are the things that are killing the Defense Department budget today. and they need to be changed. We stated very clearly that we understood just how big and how politically sensitive these issues are. And we did not believe a commission like ours was going to be able to take them on. And certainly they're not going to be able to be achieved by the Secretary of Defense. I can't imagine a secretary undertaking those problems and doing anything but causing a huge uproar in the military and in the Congress. So any chance of success will require the Congress to establish a new National Commission on Military Personnel. And the only example we could think of is going all the way back to the original Gates Commission. This is not Bob Gates, this is the earlier Gates Commission, which established the all-volunteer force. Something as fundamental as that is needed. So we urged that such a commission be established, and the charter of that commission would be how to implement the recommendations we were making in our report. We felt these recommendations were fundamental. They could not be achieved by a Secretary of Defense. They would require something that sweeping as a new commission. Finally, in a related subject, we talked about professional military education. The U.S. military's training and education program is the best in the world today and plays a key role in making the U.S. military the best in the world. So you don't want to tinker with this program lightly. It's a very important deal. Basically, we said it is expensive, but it is worth it. And we recommended some, not changes as much as augmentations to it, enhancements of the program. In particular, we recommended a full college program for reserves with summer training and a 5-year service commitment. We recommended an expanded graduate program in military affairs, foreign culture, and language. And we recommend providing key officers a sabbatical year in industry. We had a lot of discussion about that and some philosophical reasons for doing that. So it's much more important today that our military people get that background of what's going on in industry. Now, we have received already some criticism that our report gives disproportionate attention to professional military education. I'm going to close my comment by saying we reject that criticism. While our training is key, we agree, is key to preparing for current missions, professional military education is the key to preparing the military for future missions. And you're looking at a 20-year horizon, you need to be focused on that issue as well. Thank you, that's all I had to say on the subject. We're ready now for Q&A.
Started off, let me ask the both of you an initial question. The report is filled with a number of recommendations as you laid out. And some, as you indicated, are very difficult to take on, and you even proposed a further commission. But what would be the key ones, if you had your way, that the President and the Congress might start off with in the new Congress that will be here in the new year? Are there things that most importantly could be done, and do you have particular areas that in which a change could be made?
I think the two things that can be done and would make a big difference if they were done would be the changes in personnel benefits that we mentioned. That's huge. And if we fail to do that, the budgets are just going to go up so much that all the things that need to be done are going to be crimped accordingly. So that would have to be very high on the list. Second, not quite as big financially, but still quite important, is this a way of getting acquisition costs under control. I don't think there's a simple formula for doing that, but I do think setting this 5 to 7 year time limit would provide a restraint which would create, I think, some of the disciplines needed in order to deal with the problem of acquisition costs getting out of control. And both of those deal with the problem that we recognize that there are going to be more and more constraints on not just holding the defense budget, but decreasing it. And we're trying to look at sensible ways of dealing with that problem. Steve?
I just add one. There's a lot of commentary these days about how the interagency process is broken and the government doesn't work. And there is some truth to that. But I do think that that until someone figures out a new structure, we need to make the structure we have work more effectively. So I think some of the suggestions about a more strategic planning process that knits together the whole government and gives real direction to various agencies and defines responsibilities and leads and supports for the various contingencies we is a good step and something that an administration can do relatively easily in terms of getting that process going.
Let me open it up to the floor.
Bill Courtney with Computer Sciences Corporation. The QDR issued in February doesn't say much about the possibility of defense budgets becoming tighter and the need to improve productivity and efficiency. But 3 months later, Secretary Gates gave a speech in Abilene, Kansas, essentially saying that this was a very important issue, and the narrative of defense debate now is very much focused around productivity and efficiency and budget. Should planning documents like the QDR, strategy documents, should they deal with budget prospective situations, or should they be done independently? And then secondly, if the defense budget is going to be cut, and there seem to be some pressures from the likely new Congress in that direction, how do you think that can be done in a sensible way?
In the independent review panel, we took into account the efficiency initiative that Secretary Gates announced. We proposed a number of ways to save more money in the personnel system and modernization. As Bill said, our concern was all the money that's saved may not be enough to do what we think needs to be done in order to have a fully modernized force adequate to meet the challenges of the 21st century. In the strategic planning process, we recommend we talk about the need to do something in sort of first a down payment on what is your strategy, what are your objectives, what's your strategy, what are the resources you need to execute that strategy. Look at that as an unconstrained way, and then at some point you're obviously going to have to impose fiscal realities upon it in terms of the actual decisions that are made. But it's important to know what that would look like on an unconstrained basis. And that was the basis of the independent panel report. We did not talk about, and I'll give you my perspective, and then Bill may have a different one, but I think the trick of this is, and this will sound, this is sort of a jaundiced view of the politics of this town, but Republicans will tend to want to cut everything other than defense in order to balance the budget. And some liberals on the Democrat side will want to say, well, if we cut the defense budget, that's enough and we can stop. And neither is right. But we have to recognize that the deficits were driven not by the defense budget, but by entitlements and some of these other things. If we do not address these entitlements, we're kidding ourselves about getting a handle on the budget and on the deficits. If you do really take on these hard choices outside defense, it's only right to take on the hard choices within defense, and we think we've made some suggestions at how to do that. If at the end of the day a decision is made, there needs to be some cuts in the defense budget, and we recommend against that. But if in the end of the day there is, that is a, it is a good question, and some people have been saying, well, maybe we need to have a BRAC, which is a process by which a panel makes recommendations for closing military facilities, which then are voted up and down by the Congress. Maybe we need a BRAC for defense budget cuts. That is an idea, but it is putting in the hands of a group of folks some very important decisions on which our ability to protect our interests going forward are going to hang. So I think we don't, there are not a lot of good formulas for cutting the budget. It was done at the end of the Cold War, a first cut by the Bush 41 administration, some further cuts by President Clinton's administration. Some of those worked out okay. Some of those probably, in retrospect, they were premised on a much more benign world going forward than the world turned out to be. And that is why we've made some of the recommendations we do in our report. Bill?
Two comments on that. First of all, the cuts after the ending of the Cold War in defense were quite substantial. The so-called
base force, right?
Yeah,
And then the bottom up.
between the Bush and the Clinton administration, we cut $100 billion out of the defense. Now, it is also true that in the latter part of that, in the 90s, we had budget surpluses. And of course, the defense cut had something to do with that, but not everything to do with it. So it was a big deal. That was the peace dividend that we got from the Cold War. My judgment then, it was the right thing to do. That $100 billion, by the way, in defense, half of it was cut by myself and half of it was cut by, guess who? Dick Cheney. That's where the $100 billion came from. The two secretaries of defense that made those cuts. I think the increases since then have been appropriate for dealing with the increasing threat we have had since then. But we do have to look at ways of getting better efficiencies, such as we recommend in the report, because I do not think the country is going to be able to sustain the level of defense budgets we have today. Now, the final comment I want to make is somewhat relevant to this question. We made these recommendations for force reduction, and the one big one for increases was increase in the maritime force. I just want on the record to say that Secretary Gates has been clear in his response to that. He does not think those increases are necessary. I want to be sure you understand that point. I think he was generally supportive of the other recommendations we made in our report. But on that one, he specifically said, I don't think it's necessary. I think we can achieve the necessary capabilities to increase the effectiveness of the force rather than by increasing the size of the force.
Let me pick up on that, Bill and Steve, because one of the recommendations you make is you talk about one of the potential threats, I think was the phrase, were new powers. And then one of the recommendations you make is an increase in force structure in the Western Pacific. And I think without using the word China, you sort of encompassed China to some extent. And so the question I think I'd ask you is, how do you think from a Defense Department point of view and then the larger national strategy point of view going forward, we need to deal with these sets of issues with respect to the Chinese and the overall Western Pacific?
I think it's I think that's quite true, but I think also think it's important not to stimulate an arms race with China, not to declare China an enemy, because we and China both can benefit more by working together constructively on projects. But China is increasing in size, it's increasing its military capability in size. There are issues already in the South China Sea. I think the best way we can deal with those, an important element in dealing with those questions, is having a military capability in the area, which China recognizes is a very powerful force. We should not challenge China to an arms race, though. I want to be very clear about that, and I don't believe our report in any way moved in that direction. There are three. We talk about a competitor, a peer competitor in military forces rising in the future. That could be either China, it could be a resurgent Russia, it could be India. Any one of those three nations has the capability to do that, should they choose to do so. Our policy ought to be directed trying to create the conditions where they will not choose to try to do that.
I agree with everything Bill said, and I worry about the political season we're going into, both in the United States and in China, which after all is going to have a new president here in the next 2 years. And I am worried about a debate about China-U.S. relations in each country getting out of hand, and people, in some sense, outbidding themselves about focusing on the China threat and the coming confrontation with China. I put those words in quotes. You know, you got to be careful that you don't make some of this rhetoric become actually a self-fulfilling prophecy. I would hope that this World Affairs Council and other World Affairs Councils over the next year or two would try to help, in some sense, inform this debate about Asia. And it is more than China. It is Asia. If you look at where the economic growth is going to come over the next decade, it is Asia, Asia, Asia. Europe has problems. Latin America has problems. We have problems. And Asia is in a period of dramatic change. And rather than focusing on what China may be doing in Asia, I think we need to have a little discussion about what we are not doing in Asia. Asia is knitting itself together with a whole series of free trade agreements, and we are on the sideline. Finally, the administration is going to go forward with the U.S.-South Korea. Well, that is, too little too late when ASEAN is talking about establishing a free trade area with ASEAN, China, India, South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. That is a heck of a free trade area, and the United States' name does not appear on that list. So our problem is I worry that we're going to have a political debate in our country about what's going on in China and what China is doing and China's new assertiveness, when we need to be having a debate within the United States about what we need to do to get our own economic house in order, to get growth going, to be an attracting trading partner for countries, and then to be present in Asia in every dimension, diplomatically, economically, trade, as well as militarily. It will reassure our friends and allies in the region, and quite frankly, it will establish a platform on which we can manage an emerging Asia, an emerging India, and emerging China. But I think it's going to have more to do with what we're not doing than what China is doing. There's a sense in Asia that the United States is, looking elsewhere, and that is dangerous.
A footnote to Steve's comments is that our two wars, insurgent wars going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, have a huge opportunity cost in our inattention to Asia generally. The inattention militarily, economically, diplomatically, in all dimensions.
And I just have to say, my response is, they can, but they don't necessarily have to. And one of the purposes of our report was to say, yes, Bob Gates, you're right, we got to fight and win the wars we're in, and we also have to do the planning looking beyond those wars so we're positioned to defend our interests in the world we see in the 21st century.
Yes, Yan Ho Kim with Voice of America. Another question about Asia. The QDR actually touched the military challenges by North Korea in it. But do you think the U.S. policies laid out in the QDR were comprehensive or effective enough to deal with North Korea's provocations, including the recent artillery shelling of South Korean island? Thank you.
Steve. Well, I think it will not be headline news to say that we have not succeeded in our objectives with North Korea. It is still a very provocative, risk-taking regime. It is still pursuing nuclear weapons. We now know that it has a very sophisticated enrichment program, something that we were getting whiffs of and were concerned about. And it is still one of the most gruesome regimes in the world in terms of the life of its people living under that regime. So obviously, we have not had policies that have succeeded. I think the administration is taking the right approach in terms of a pretty tough line with North Korea. This provocative behavior is obviously a problem. It is difficult to deal with. I think one of the reasons this is an area to watch is that South Korea has now said that enough of tolerating North Korean military action without response, they're going to respond, and they're going to respond not tit for tat, they're going to respond with air power. That is that's an important change. And secondly, the administration was very quick to have a show of U.S. military power in exercising with South Korea. I think that was also a good thing to do. We will see what kind of lessons North Korea draws from that. The problem with North Korea is, when we used to say, people would say, well, why don't you show a red line for North Korea? With North Korea, if you establish a red line, the first thing they do is to try to jump over it, because they are all about getting attention, creating a sense of crisis in order to try to provoke compensation and basically bribed to calm down. And that is a pattern that's been difficult to break North Korea about. So I think, A, we have not yet got the magic formula. B, I think this is a period of some risk, and I hope North Korea would recognize that it's not in their interest now to try to bait and provoke South Korea. Bill?
I don't want to comment specifically on the North Korean nuclear program, but a narrow focus, but a very important focus of our concern with North Korea. Dr. Hecker visited there just a few weeks ago, was given a tour of their nuclear facilities, and then later met with the Secretary of State. He proposed a policy in the nuclear field which I think is quite sensible. He said if we continue to go in on the negotiations that North Korea will not have any nuclear capability, it's kind of a losing battle. We should start off by where they are today and try to contain that. He said the immediate objectives, he thought, of negotiation with North Korea in the nuclear field should be what he called the 3 no's. No more bombs, no improved bombs, and no transfer. Now those are big restraints over what they're doing right now. It does not get us to a non-nuclear North Korea, but certainly is an important step in that direction. If we made those as negotiating objectives, he thought we had, and I think we have some chance of success. As long as our negotiating objectives is North Korea won't talk to you until you give up your nuclear weapons, we're not going to get anywhere, I think. So that's his recommendation, and it's a recommendation which he's made to the Secretary of State, which I support. And it's I'm very distressed that we're in the position we are today with North Korea's nuclear program. And if we could relive history, we could maybe find ways of not having gotten in that position. But that's where we are. And given where we are today, I think his recommendation makes a lot of sense.
The problem, which shows you the difficulty, is we've got 2 issues we're working at the same time, North Korea and Iran. And our position with Iran, of course, is no enrichment, no path to a nuclear weapon. And one of the problems is how do you, and that's one of the reasons we tried to get North Korea, and North Korea agreed, people forget, in September of 2005 to a denuclearization of the peninsula and no nuclear capability at all. One of the reasons for that is we felt we needed to have symmetry between what we wanted from Iran and what we were asking for North Korea. And the different situations between Iran and North Korea now are putting pressure on that proposition. But one of the things that makes this so difficult is what we do with Iran is being watched by North Korea, what we do with North Korea is being watched by Iran. And it's a very, very difficult management challenge.
Hi, I'm Gweta Mazzetti. I sit on Defense Science Board with Dr. Schlesinger and others, and I've worked on energy issues, and this is a good segue because I think it relates to cyber, although I have a myriad of questions for you. Could you comment, I know for the first time that QDR addressed energy, could you comment on energy as a game changer and a strategic asset and how it threads through each of the other themes that you've mentioned?
Energy is relating to the defense in particular.
Not just defense, but world affairs and where we have to put our assets, both fuel and electricity.
Well, it's been said by others, and I'll just repeat it, that the United States, I guess it was said first by Eisenhower, that the United States' dependence on imported fuel is a huge national security problem. And at that time, he was saying, if I remember, it should not go above 20%. Well, it's gone way beyond that since then. But I think Eisenhower was right, and so I agree on that point. The second is the things we can be doing. The defense has a particular problem with energy, and it has a huge dependence on fuel, and that fuel has to be sometimes in places very hard to deliver it. The cost of a gallon of gasoline in Washington, D.C. is high enough, but you imagine what the real cost of a gallon of gasoline at an outpost based in Afghanistan. And not only cost in dollars, but the cost in lives of getting it there. So there's a very great imperative in the Defense Department to find ways of decreasing their dependence on the use of energy. It's not just a matter whether it's foreign fuel or U.S. fuel. It's the use of gasoline at all, and oil, jet fuel, and so on at all. And so that calls for finding alternative sources of energy. It calls for decreasing the use of fuel. One simple example is we drive Humvees all over Iraq and Afghanistan, which are enormous fuel consumers. Nobody's driving them around the United States anymore because they use so much fuel. But the problem is even greater when they're being driven in Afghanistan. So a simple thought is, could we develop, for example, a hybrid engine for something like the Humvee to reduce the use of it? Steve?
I just add two things. We did not focus a lot on that in the report. I thought one of the most interesting things is when we came up with a list of what are the 5 challenges in the next century to our ability to pursue our 4 core interests. One of the ones that got on that list out of the group was increasing or accelerating competition for natural resources. And that, I think, is the future. And we're, not a lot of people are talking about that, but that is going to be a real challenge for us. On the point Bill mentioned, we talked about for a while, and some people thought whether we should recommend as part of our acquisition and procurement reform that energy conservation and reducing consumption of energy should be part of the design criteria for our defense systems. And we toyed with that idea, and we actually concluded we didn't know enough about the consequences to make that as a recommendation. But somebody needs to take that one on.
Well, let me thank the both of you. I think that everyone understands why I said that you really have heard from 2 extraordinary Americans. They are the best that we have. The report itself bears close reading. I had read it once in August. I read it again this morning. It brings a lot of things up. I think the suggestion, the exhortation by Steve and by Bill that groups like ours understand what's being proposed and make it part of the conversation, because it's not a self-executing report. It needs to be brought into the political process is terribly important. There are a lot of things to be done out there, some in the shorter term and some in the long term. And I think that having both of you here was just a privilege, and really I appreciate it myself, and I thank you for the council and for all of us. So thank you very, very much for a great team.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.